Why are houses only 30, 40, or $50,000 in the US? Welcome to Owner Finance Academy, where we help Canadians build wealth by buying US real estate and selling it with owner financing. Before we begin, a quick reminder that everything shared on this channel is for educational purposes only. Every situation is different, so please do consult with a qualified legal, tax, and accounting professional before making your final decisions. In this lesson, we're going to answer one of the first questions almost every Canadian asks when they discover the US slow flip real estate strategy. How can some houses be 30, 40, or $50,000? By the end of this video, you'll understand why these prices exist, why they are legitimate, and how to tell between a genuine good opportunity and properties you should avoid. So, let's get started. This question is important. If you spent your life looking at Canadian real estate, seeing a detached house listed for $30,000 feels impossible. Your first reaction is usually one of the three. You assume it's a scam, you assume the house must be falling apart, or you assume there's some other hidden catch. Those reactions are understandable because you're comparing these prices to one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, in Canada. The problem is that you're comparing two completely different real estate markets. The United States is not one housing market, it is thousands of local housing markets, each with different economies, different employment levels, different population trends, taxes, housing supply, different demand. Some markets are extremely expensive, others are remarkably affordable. The fact that inexpensive houses exist does not automatically make them good investments, but it also does not automatically make them scams. Understanding why these houses exist is the first step toward evaluating them rationally instead of emotionally. Now, low prices do not mean low value. That's one of the biggest mindset shifts for Canadians. Price tells you what someone is asking. Value is what the property is actually worth in its market. Those are not always the same thing. If a house is worth 40,000 and someone sells it for 32, that may represent an opportunity. If a house is listed for 30,000 but would require 80,000 in repairs before anyone could live there, it may actually be very expensive. The number alone tells you almost nothing. Professional investors don't ask, why is this house so cheap? No, they ask a different set of questions. They would ask, hmm, it's cheap compared to what? That comparison is what is really key. Why prices can be so low? Well, there are a few reasons. There isn't just one. Really, it's a combination of things. Usually, several factors combine together to produce a low price. The first could be local income. Housing prices generally reflect what people in that area can actually afford to pay. If average household incomes are lower, housing prices tend to be lower as well. The second factor is housing supply. Many Midwest communities built large number of homes decades ago for manufacturing industries, and some of those industries, as you know, later declined, but the houses remained. Another, demand changed, prices adjusted. Another factor is population movement. Some communities have experienced decades of people moving elsewhere for employment. When population decreases while housing inventory remains relatively stable, prices often come down. So these are all economic forces. They are not signs that very inexpensive property is distressed or undesirable. They simply explain why prices differ dramatically from one market to another. Distressed property is not the same as a distressed neighborhood. This is another important distinction. A distressed property is simply a property that is selling below its potential market value. And that can happen for many reasons. Perhaps the owner inherited it, perhaps they are behind on payments, Perhaps they moved away. Perhaps they simply want a quick sale. The condition of the property might be perfectly acceptable, or it might need work. A distressed property does not automatically mean the surrounding neighborhood is distressed. Likewise, a distressed neighborhood does not automatically mean every investment there is poor. Professional investors evaluate each property individually. They don't rely on assumptions created by the purchase price alone. Now, people often assume that every seller wants the highest possible price. In reality, sellers have different priorities. Some value certainty more than maximizing profits. Imagine someone who owns a vacant property. They no longer want it. The house requires maintenance. Property taxes continue every year. Insurance still has to be paid. Utilities may still be connected. Maybe the owner lives in another state. Every month they continue owning that property costs them money. If a buyer offers them an all cash purchase with very few conditions, a quick closing, many sellers willingly accept a lower price in exchange for speed and certainty. That is how many discounted transactions occur. The seller is not necessarily making a bad decision, it's solving a different problem. Retail buyers usually buy one home. They buy based primarily on emotion. They picture themselves living there. Investors like you buy based on numbers. They calculate whether the property fits their business model. That difference changes negotiations, changes everything. If an investor knows a property only works financially below a certain purchase price, they simply won't exceed that purchase price. If the seller accepts it, great. If not, they just move on. Discipline is really important and it matters a lot more than emotion. One of the biggest reasons investors lose money is paying more than the property supports simply because they want that particular house. In this course, one of the earliest lessons focuses entirely on market selection. Before looking at individual houses, you first learn how to identify markets where this strategy itself can work consistently. The objective is not to find the absolute cheapest houses. The objective is to find markets where several conditions all work together so that you can continue the strategy for the long haul. You need purchase prices that make financial sense. You need monthly payments that your occupants, your buyers, can realistically afford. You need workable legal processes. And you need enough inventory that you can repeat this strategy over and over and over again without relying on fortune. Choosing a market always comes before choosing a property. That's a key distinction. Many beginners do the exact opposite. They find a cheap house online first and only afterwards begin asking whether the market makes sense for this slow flip strategy, and that is completely backwards. The market determines whether the strategy is repeatable. The individual property simply needs to fit inside that market. So, it's probably the most important point in today's lesson. Low price alone never makes a good investment. Professional investors like you have to reject properties, perhaps more than you accept them. You reject houses because the layout doesn't work. You reject a house because the condition is unacceptable. You might reject a house because the insurance is going to be too tough to obtain, because municipal issues exist, because the numbers simply don't work. One inexpensive property might become an excellent long term investment. Another equally inexpensive property across the street could become an expensive mistake. Price is only one variable among many. In the full course, we teach students how to build both a financial profile and a physical profile for an ideal property before you even start making offers. Those filters will reduce your poor buying decisions. Once you've found the market that appears suitable, the next step is learning how to evaluate individual properties objectively. First question is rather simple. What is the house actually worth today in its current condition? The answer comes from recent comparable sales, often called sales comps. You compare similar houses that have recently sold nearby. You're not trying to predict what the house might be worth in 5 years. You're trying to estimate what it's worth today. If comparable sales suggest an as-is value of approximately 40,000, buying at 35 may make sense. Paying 45 probably does not, even though 45 would be considered cheap for a Canadian. That simple discipline protects you from overpaying. The other question is equally important. Can the monthly payment you eventually charge your occupant realistically fit within what similar homes rent for in that neighborhood? See, if local rents support $850 a month for payment, your financing structure has to be within that realm. If you're going to require $1,200 a month, well, you're out of range. Notice what we're evaluating. We're not chasing appreciation. We're not hoping prices rise. We're asking whether today's numbers work using today's market. And that will create a much more predictable investment process. Canadians naturally compare everything to Canadian housing, and that's normal, but it creates a few common mistakes. First is assuming that every inexpensive US house must have a fatal problem. Second mistake is assuming that every inexpensive US house is an incredible bargain. Neither of these assumptions is always correct. The only way to develop good judgment is through repetition. You need to study many properties before attempting to buy even one. When you review dozens or even hundreds of listings within the same market, then you start to see patterns that emerge. You start to recognize normal prices. You learn what typical conditions look like. You understand which neighborhoods consistently meet your criteria. Eventually, inexpensive prices stop feeling shocking because you've developed context and you know what you're looking at and what you're looking for. That context is a lot more valuable than chasing the lowest asking price. The goal here is repeatability. One misconception about investing is that success comes from finding one amazing deal, but in reality, successful investing is usually much less dramatic. It comes from repeating a sound process over time and time again. If you depend on discovering one unbelievable bargain, your results become unpredictable. Instead, you want a system. Choose an appropriate market, study the houses, define your financial criteria, define your physical criteria for the property, evaluate properties consistently, make disciplined offers, don't rush, don't become impatient, rinse, and repeat. Now, the objective of all of this is not perfection. In fact, you'll never find perfection. The objective is consistency in the midst of the imperfection. That's what allows a portfolio to grow over time. Now, a word about risk. I also want to emphasize something that often gets overlooked. Affordable houses are not risk free. Every investment carries risk, of course, you know that, but some properties have structural issues. Some neighborhoods experience economic challenges. Some occupants who buy the houses from you, well, sometimes they stop making payments, and some deals simply don't work. Now, you can't completely eliminate risk, you know that. The goal is understanding it before you commit your money. And that means you need to research. It requires you to research, it requires you to be disciplined, it requires you to trust but verify. It also requires you to have a willingness to walk away whenever the numbers or the property just doesn't fit your criteria. Professional investors often earn their best returns not because of the deals they buy, but because of the deals they refuse to buy. Now, the opportunity exists because many buyers never get past their first emotional reaction. They see a $30,000 house and immediately they dismiss it. Others become so excited by the price that they ignore obvious warning signs. Neither approach is particularly useful. Investors who approach these markets often discover that some inexpensive properties represent a legitimate opportunity while others do not. And the difference really comes down to your analysis, not your emotion. And that's why education and this academy is so important. When you understand how to evaluate markets, compare properties, analyze rents, estimate values, structure the deal conservatively, low prices on a house become an easier to assess and an easier objective to attain. So instead of asking, why is this house only 30 grand or 40 grand? You begin to ask things like, does this property meet my criteria? And that's a much better question when you're engaging in this slow flip strategy. So, Let's summarize what we've covered today. Low prices in the US are a real thing. Their prices are usually explained by the local economic conditions, housing supply, population trends, and the seller's circumstances. Low prices doesn't always mean a good investment. Every property needs to be evaluated using comparable sales, local rental demand, physical condition, and you, of course, need to do a disciplined financial analysis. As a successful investor, you want to study the market before you study an individual house. You'll develop some very clear criteria before you start making offers, and you'll understand that consistency is much more important than finding a spectacular deal. So, if you'd like to learn this complete Owner Finance Academy system for Canadians who want to invest remotely in the US, you'll find a link to the full course in the description. Inside the course, I show you exactly how to choose a market, how to analyze deal, how to know when a property is the right fit, avoiding mistakes. It's full of checklists and calculators and tools to help you succeed. Now, if you're not ready for the course just yet, that's all right. You can download a free slow flip viability diagnostic test. It will help you identify if the one property you might be looking at right now is a good fit for the strategy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.